December 1941. Across the Atlantic, in the heart of Nazi Germany, many leaders believed the war was already decided. Britain was battered, the Soviet Union was under immense pressure, and the United States, distant, divided, and officially neutral, was seen as a slow-moving giant unlikely to intervene in time to matter. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a matter of hours, the strategic balance of the war shifted. On December 7th, Japanese aircraft struck the American Pacific Fleet, destroying battleships, killing over 2,400 Americans, and pulling the United States into a global conflict it had tried to avoid. Just days later, Germany, under Adolf Hitler, declared war on the United States. It was a decision that would prove irreversible. At first, the reaction in Germany was not fear, but confidence. Many German officials believed the United States lacked the will for a prolonged war. They saw a country still recovering from the Great Depression, a society focused on consumer goods rather than military discipline. To them, America was powerful, but soft. But what they underestimated was not just America's military, it was its capacity. Within weeks, the United States began transforming at a pace the world had never seen. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and typewriters were retooled to build tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The scale was staggering. By 1942, American industry was producing more military equipment than entire nations combined. Automobile plants operated by companies like Ford Motor Company and General Motors stopped civilian production almost entirely. Instead, they turned assembly lines into engines of war. At Ford's Willow Run plant, a single bomber, the B-24 Liberator, was being produced nearly every hour at its peak. This was not just manufacturing, it was industrial warfare. And it wasn't just machines, it was manpower. Millions of Americans enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces. Farmers, factory workers, students, ordinary people became soldiers almost overnight. By the end of the war, over 16 million Americans would serve in uniform. At the same time, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles in factories and shipyards. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of a nation fully mobilized. Back in Germany, intelligence reports began to paint a different picture. What once seemed like a distant threat was becoming something far more dangerous. American shipyards were launching vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft production numbers were climbing at a rate that defied logic. The United States was not just preparing for war, it was preparing to dominate it. In 1940, the United States had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1943, that number would exceed 85,000 in a single year. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, everything was being produced in overwhelming quantities. The term arsenal of democracy, used by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was no exaggeration. It was a warning. But perhaps the most alarming realization for Germany was not just how much America could produce, but how quickly it could deploy it. Convoys began crossing the Atlantic, carrying supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. These shipments included food, fuel, trucks, and weapons, lifelines that kept Allied nations in the fight. Despite the constant threat of German submarines, the flow of resources never truly stopped. German commanders started to notice a pattern. Every loss the Allies suffered seemed temporary. Every destroyed tank or downed plane was replaced, sometimes within weeks. The United States was turning time itself into a weapon. And yet, in the early days, there was still doubt. Could American soldiers match the experience of German troops? Could a nation that had been at peace for so long adapt to the brutality of modern warfare? These questions lingered in the minds of German strategists, but beneath the surface, the answer was already forming.
Training camps spread across the United States, new doctrines were being developed, coordination between air, land, and sea forces was improving rapidly. The U.S. military was learning, adapting, and preparing for not just a single battle, but for a global war on an unprecedented scale. By late 1942, the signs were impossible to ignore. The United States was no longer a distant power. It was an active, growing force, one that was beginning to project its strength across oceans. In North Africa, American troops would soon face German forces directly. In the skies over Europe, American bombers would begin to appear in increasing numbers. The sleeping giant was no longer asleep. For Germany, what once seemed like a manageable conflict was evolving into something far more dangerous. A new kind of enemy had entered the war, one with unmatched industrial strength, vast resources, and the ability to sustain a long, relentless fight. The balance of power was shifting, and although the full weight of American military power had not yet been unleashed, its shadow was already falling across the battlefield. The war was changing.
By 1942, the war had entered a new phase. What had once been a conflict of rapid offensives and lightning victories was turning into something slower, heavier, and far more dangerous. Germany was still powerful, still fighting across multiple fronts, but a new pressure was building. Not from a single army, not from a single battle, but from an entire system that was beginning to outproduce, outsupply, and outlast it. At the center of this shift was the United States. American industry was no longer ramping up, it was already in full motion. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Shipyards on both coasts were launching cargo vessels known as Liberty ships at an astonishing rate, sometimes one completed in just a few days. These ships became the backbone of Allied logistics, carrying everything from ammunition to food across dangerous waters. German U-boats, once feared as the dominant force in the Atlantic, suddenly faced an impossible equation. For every ship they managed to sink, several more seemed to take its place. The strategy that had once threatened to choke Britain into submission was losing its effectiveness. And in the air, a similar pattern was emerging. American aircraft production surged beyond anything Germany had anticipated. Fighters like the P-51 Mustang and bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress began to appear in growing numbers over Europe. These were not isolated raids. They were part of a larger, coordinated effort, waves of aircraft designed to strike industrial centers, railways, and supply lines deep inside German territory. For the first time, the war was coming home. Factories that had once operated safely beyond the reach of enemy forces were now targets. Oil refineries, critical to the German war machine, became priority objectives. Without fuel, tanks could not move, planes could not fly, and entire divisions could be rendered useless. The American strategy was becoming clear. Weaken Germany not just on the battlefield, but at its core. Meanwhile, on land, the buildup of American forces continued. The United States was not just producing weapons, it was mastering logistics on a scale the world had never seen. Trucks, trains, and supply depots were organized with precision. Entire systems were designed to ensure that soldiers at the front would never run out of food, ammunition, or equipment. In contrast, Germany began to feel the strain. Fighting a war on multiple fronts required constant resupply, but resources were limited. Oil shortages became increasingly severe. Replacement equipment was harder to produce and slower to reach the front lines. The advantage that Germany once held in speed and coordination was slowly eroding. Yet perhaps the most critical difference was time. Germany needed quick victories. Its strategy depended on decisive action, short campaigns that would overwhelm enemies before they could fully respond. But the United States operated differently. It was preparing for a long war, one where endurance mattered more than speed.
Every month that passed strengthened the American position. Every factory that ran, every ship that crossed the ocean, every soldier that completed training, these were not isolated contributions. They were part of a growing force, one that was becoming impossible to ignore. German intelligence reports began to reflect this reality. The numbers were alarming. American production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery was not just increasing, it was surpassing Germany's ability to compete. Even when German forces achieved local victories, they could not replace their losses as quickly as the Allies could. And then there was the coordination. The United States was not just fighting alone. Its industrial output supported not only its own military, but also its allies. Through programs like Lend-Lease, American supplies flowed to Britain and the Soviet Union, strengthening both fronts simultaneously. This created a strategic dilemma for Germany. No matter where it focused its efforts, it faced an enemy that was constantly being reinforced. Pressure from the east, pressure from the west, pressure from the sky. It was becoming relentless. Still, there were those in Germany who believed victory was possible. They pointed to experienced troops, superior tactics, and moments of battlefield success. But beneath those arguments was a growing concern, one that could not be easily dismissed. The war was no longer just about strategy or skill. It was about capacity. And in that category, the United States was in a league of its own. By late 1942 and into 1943, the signs were undeniable. The balance was shifting, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a steady, unstoppable flow. More ships, more planes, more tanks, more soldiers. Germany was not yet defeated. Its armies were still dangerous, still capable of fierce resistance, but the foundation of its war effort was beginning to crack under the weight of a new kind of enemy, one that fought not only with weapons, but with production lines, supply chains, and an economy fully committed to victory. The full force had not yet arrived, but it was coming, and when it did, it would not strike at once, but everywhere, all the time, without pause.
By 1943, the war had reached a turning point. The momentum that once fueled German expansion was beginning to slow, then shift, and in some places collapse entirely. What had started as a series of rapid victories was now turning into a grinding, exhausting struggle. And at the center of this change was a growing realization: Germany was no longer dictating the course of the war. The Allies were. One of the first major signs came in North Africa. For months, German forces under Erwin Rommel had fought with remarkable skill, earning a reputation as one of Germany's most capable commanders. His tactics were bold, his movements unpredictable. But even brilliance has limits, especially when supply lines begin to fail. American forces, alongside British troops, began to push back. The arrival of fresh American units brought not only manpower, but something far more critical: resources. Tanks, fuel, ammunition, and constant reinforcements began tipping the balance. Battles like Kasserine Pass exposed early weaknesses in American forces, but they also forced rapid adaptation. The U.S. Army learned quickly, adjusting tactics and improving coordination. And then the tide turned. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa were trapped. With no escape and no resupply, over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. It was a massive blow, comparable in scale to some of the largest defeats of the war. For the first time, Germany had lost an entire theater. But this was only the beginning. Soon after, the Allies launched an invasion of Italy. What had once seemed unthinkable, a direct assault on Axis-controlled Europe, was now a reality. American troops landed on Italian shores, supported by naval power and relentless air cover. The campaign was slow and difficult, but its message was clear: Germany could no longer defend everything. At the same time,
The skies above Europe were changing. American bombers flying deep into German territory began carrying out large-scale daylight raids. Factories, rail networks, and industrial centers became targets. These missions were dangerous, losses were often high, but they continued day after day. The goal was not just destruction, but disruption. Every damaged railway delayed supplies. Every destroyed factory slowed production. Every bomb dropped weakened Germany's ability to sustain the war. Cities that had once felt secure were now under constant threat. Air raid sirens became a part of daily life. Civilians and workers alike were drawn into the reality of total war, where no place was truly safe. And then, on the Eastern Front, another devastating blow struck German forces. The Battle of Stalingrad had already marked a turning point, but its consequences were still unfolding. German losses were enormous, and the Soviet Union, now receiving increasing support through American supplies, began pushing westward with growing power. The pressure from the East intensified just as the West began to ignite. Germany was being squeezed. From North Africa to Italy, from the skies above its cities to the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The Allies were no longer reacting, they were advancing, strategically, methodically, and with increasing confidence. And behind much of this momentum was American power. Not always visible on the front lines, but always present. In the trucks delivering supplies, in the aircraft filling the skies, in the steady flow of equipment that ensured Allied forces could keep moving forward. For German commanders, the challenge was becoming overwhelming. They were forced to make impossible choices, reinforce one front and risk losing another, hold territory or retreat and preserve strength. But even retreat came at a cost, as every step backward meant giving up ground that had once been hard won. The idea of a quick victory was gone. Now it was a fight for survival. There were still moments of resistance, still battles where German forces showed their skill and determination, but these victories were becoming isolated, temporary successes in a war that was steadily turning against them. The initiative had changed hands, and perhaps most importantly, so had the mindset. The Allies, once cautious and defensive, now were aggressive and coordinated. They were planning larger operations, preparing for something even bigger. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy were shaping a new kind of warfare, one that combined overwhelming force with precise execution. Germany could feel it coming. The pressure was building, not in one place, but everywhere. What had once been cracks in the system were now widening into fractures. The war was no longer balanced. It was tilting, slowly but decisively. And soon there would come a moment when all of this pressure, all of this preparation would be unleashed at once. A moment that would define the future of the war. The tide had turned. Now it was rising.
By 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical point. Germany was still fighting, still holding vast territory, but the pressure from all sides had become relentless. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of Soviet advances. The skies were no longer safe, and in the West, something massive was about to unfold. For months, the Allies had been preparing in secret. Troops gathered in Britain, equipment piled up along the southern coast, ships, landing craft, tanks, and aircraft were assembled in numbers never seen before. This was not just another operation, it was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The target? Nazi-occupied France. The operation would be known as D-Day. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion began. Before the first soldier even set foot on the beaches, thousands of paratroopers had already dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission was to disrupt German defenses, capture key positions, and create chaos. Then came the naval bombardment.
Warships opened fire along the Normandy coastline, targeting bunkers, artillery positions, and defensive fortifications. The ground shook as shells struck the shore. For German forces stationed there, it was the beginning of something they had long feared, but never fully believed would happen at this scale. And then the first wave arrived. American, British, and Canadian troops landed across 5 beaches. Among them, the American sectors, Omaha and Utah, would become some of the most intense battlefields of the entire war. At Omaha Beach, soldiers faced heavy machine gun fire, artillery, and obstacles designed to stop them in the water. Many never made it ashore. But those who did kept moving. Despite the chaos, despite the losses, they pushed forward, climbing cliffs, breaking through defenses, and slowly carving out a foothold. It was not fast, it was not clean, but it was relentless. German defenses, though strong, were overwhelmed by the scale of the assault. Communication lines were disrupted, reinforcements were delayed, confusion spread among commanders. Some units fought fiercely, holding positions as long as they could, but others were caught off guard, unable to respond quickly enough to the sheer height of the invasion. And above it all, the sky belonged to the Allies. Thousands of aircraft provided cover, attacked German positions, and ensured that reinforcements could not easily reach the battlefield. Every road, every bridge, every movement was under threat. Germany's ability to respond was being systematically dismantled. Within days, the Allies had secured the beaches. What began as a desperate landing had turned into a growing invasion force. Supplies poured in, more troops arrived, tanks rolled onto the continent. The foothold in Normandy expanded, village by village, field by field. For Germany, the situation was becoming critical. They had expected an invasion, but not this one, not here, and not at this scale. Deception operations had convinced many German leaders that the main attack would come elsewhere, leaving Normandy less reinforced than it could have been. Now it was too late. Attempts to push the Allies back into the sea failed. Counterattacks were launched, but they lacked coordination and support. Fuel shortages, damaged infrastructure, and constant air attacks made movement difficult. Every delay worked in favor of the Allies, who were growing stronger with each passing day. The balance had shifted permanently. What made this moment different was not just the success of the landing, but what it represented. For the first time since the early years of the war, a massive Allied force had established a strong presence in Western Europe. A second front had been opened. Germany was now fighting a war it could not control. From the east, Soviet forces advanced with increasing speed. From the west, American and Allied troops pushed inward from Normandy. And from above, the bombing campaigns continued without pause. There was no relief. There was no time to recover. Every front demanded attention, resources, and reinforcements, but there were not enough to go around. The invasion of Normandy was not the end of the war, but it was the moment everything changed. It marked the beginning of the final phase, a phase where Germany was no longer advancing, no longer holding steady, but slowly, inevitably, being pushed back. The hammer had fallen, and it would not stop.
By late 1944, the war had entered its final and most desperate phase for Germany. The fronts were no longer stable lines, they were collapsing boundaries, constantly shifting under relentless pressure. What had once been a campaign of expansion had turned into a fight for survival. From the west, Allied forces pushed out of Normandy and surged across France with increasing speed. Cities were liberated one after another. Supply lines stretched, but they did not break. Behind every advancing unit was a system that kept it moving, fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, all arriving with precision. American Kuwa was no longer building, it had fully arrived. Columns of tanks rolled forward, supported by mechanized infantry and constant air cover. The coordination between ground and air forces had reached a level Germany could no longer match.
Every German movement risked detection. Every counterattack faced overwhelming resistance. And yet, Germany did not surrender. In December 1944, in a final attempt to regain the initiative, German forces launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was bold: break through Allied lines, split their forces, and capture key supply ports. At first, it worked. The surprise attack created a bulge in the Allied front lines. American units, caught off guard, were forced to retreat in some areas. Harsh winter conditions added to the chaos. For a brief moment, it seemed like Germany might slow the inevitable. But only for a moment. The same factors that had been building throughout the war, American production, logistics, and coordination, quickly came into play. Reinforcements arrived. Air power returned as the weather cleared. Supplies continued to flow. German forces, already stretched thin, began to run out of fuel and ammunition. Tanks were abandoned. Advances stalled. What started as a bold offensive turned into another costly failure. After the Ardennes, there was little left to stop the Allied advance. By early 1945, American and Allied forces were crossing into Germany itself. Towns and cities that had once supported the war effort were now battlefields. The Jang had come home in full force. At the same time, from the east, Soviet armies were closing in on Berlin. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces. Inside the country, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Infrastructure was destroyed, communication was failing, supplies were scarce. Civilians faced constant fatigue from air raids and the chaos of a collapsing state. Still, orders were given to fight on. But reality could no longer be ignored. German soldiers, many of them young or exhausted, faced an enemy that seemed endless. For every position they tried to hold, more Allied troops arrived. For every Humla they attempted, they were met with superior firepower. The imbalance was absolute. This was no longer a war of maneuver or strategy. It was a collapse. American forces continued their advance, capturing key industrial regions, crossing rivers, and breaking through defensive lines. The Rhine, once seen as a natural barrier, was crossed. The heart of Germany was now exposed. Every day the front moved closer to the end. And then, in April 1945, Allied forces linked up with Soviet armies advancing from the east. Germany was effectively cut in half. There was nowhere left to retreat, no reserves left to deploy. The war in Europe was ending. In Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, Adolf Hitler remained in his bunker, issuing orders that could no longer be carried out. The leadership had lost control, disconnected from the reality on the ground. Days later, he would be dead. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies. The conflict in Europe, which had consumed millions of lives, had finally come to an end. What remained was the realization of what had happened. Germany had not been defeated in a single battle or by a single decision. It had been overwhelmed, slowly, relentlessly, by a combination of forces it could not match. Among them, the full weight of American military power. Not just in soldiers or weapons, but in the ability to sustain war on a scale that reshaped the conflict itself. Factories, supply chains, transportation, coordination, these were the forces that turned the tide and ensured that once the balance shifted, it would never shift back. In the end, the outcome became inevitable. The pressure never stopped, and eventually, Germany could no longer withstand it.